Hello, folks. It's Bradley J and the Bradley J Show. And once again, it's Friday. And once again, Rich Rubino is with us. He's a political historian. And sometimes I can squeeze some commentary out of him, but that he doesn't like to do that. He's more of a historian. He likes to keep his nose clean on the commentary. But, from time to time, we'll get some. Today, we're going to talk about Mavericks. We're going to talk about Mavericks, American political Mavericks. What is a political maverick? Do you have to be in the right, the left? Can you be a moderate? Do you have to be extreme? And what sort of fate befalls the American political maverick? Well, Rich, what's a maverick?
Yeah, and people can be completely nonplussed by this because essentially it can go the center, it can go to the right, and it can go to the left. Essentially, and by the way, there was a congressman named Samuel Maverick, and he was known as a maverick because back in 1935, he was the only Southern Democrat who opposed lynching laws, for example. So he used that term. It actually goes back to his grandfather. But essentially, a maverick is just somebody who is independent. And in the political arena, it's somebody who's independent of their party. Now, we're seeing this contemporaneously in a few respects. On the Democratic side, you often see this with Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. Two actually pretty difficult, pretty distant cases. In Joe Manchin's case, you can see why. He represents West Virginia. He's a Democrat. West Virginia was Donald Trump's best state in 2016, second best only to Wyoming in 2020. Yet Joe Manchin gets reelected in 2018. So in part by his opposition to Build Back Better, by his support of the filibuster, he shows that he's not a traditional liberal, and that helps him politically. Kirsten Sinema is a completely different case. She's somebody who began her political career actually as a Ralph Nader accolade, basically an anti-war candidate saying that Al Gore and Joe Lieberman were too far to the center. Then she goes to Congress and she gradually becomes a centrist. But she comes from a state that actually has a Democratic governor, a Democratic senator, and a state that is gradually tending to become more and more Democrat. Yet she is still a maverick to the point that she did not, she actually changed her party affiliation from Democrat to independent, although she caucuses with Democrats. And it's actually having deleterious effects on her politically because now she was somebody who probably would have been pretty much a shoo-in to win the Democratic nomination for re-election had she gone, 95% with her party. Now that she's an independent, Ruben Gallego, a very liberal congressman from Arizona, is now running as a Democratic. Says today that he's actually going to run for the Democratic nomination, meaning it's actually harder for her now to win re-election versus when she had just gone kind of the party line. So very divergent, but those are the two that I think are really kind of in the national spotlight or the national news today.
All right. Here's a comment. See what you think. George Santos was a maverick too. Is that true?
I wouldn't say so. I think he's becoming more of a maverick, but he was somebody.
So?
No, he was somebody that basically ran as a traditional center-right Republican in a congressional district that went 4 points for Joe Biden last time around. After he was elected and before the scandal came to light, he basically said, I'm somebody who's going to work with both sides. I'm going to work across the aisle. But he didn't really necessarily run as somebody who was either a conservative maverick or somebody who kind of ran against his party. He ran as a traditional Republican, a traditional kind of center-right establishment type Republican, although he was very complimentary of Donald Trump, which is kind of interesting because the district is not a Donald Trump district. But he garnered the nomination, and now he's in Congress, and now you hear him going on Steve Bannon's podcast. You see him talking to many conservative sources. He certainly has moved kind of to the right in that respect.
By the way, as an aside, what does it say about the party where a guy like George Santos is actually getting committee assignments? He's got a couple, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know how you don't give him committee assignments necessarily if you are Kevin McCarthy and if you are the respective steering committee. You have to give him something. Now, that being said, Marjorie Taylor Greene did not get committee assignments when the Democrats had hegemony the last time around, but now she gets them. In Marjorie Taylor Greene's case, you can totally see why, because she basically saved Kevin McCarthy with the right wing of the Republican Party by being a tribune of his cause. So obviously there has to be a little bit of reciprocity, and part of that is putting her on the Homeland Security Committee. In the case of George Santos, they put him on the Small Business Committee. That's generally a committee that lots of freshmen get on. Very rarely do freshmen get on more omnipotent committees, omnipotent committees like Ways and Means Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, Armed Services Committee. Sometimes they'll get on, but they're trying to basically give him what I think was the lowest committee you can possibly give him. But that being said, they are responsible for, SBA loans and that type of thing. And as soon, I think that, this is Kevin McCarthy's got a real dilemma in here. It's kind of a conundrum, if you will. On the one hand, he does not want the publicity of George Santos. And I think if he had his way, George Santos would not be in the United States Congress. Contrary-wise, there's a 222 to 211 majority that the Republicans have. He represents a district that is marginally Democratic. If George Santos were to resign and there were to be a special election, or if he were to say, you know what, you don't give me any committee assignments, screw this, I'm leaving, then the Republicans are down one more seat. And it actually is consequential because it's not like they have a 50 vote majority and they can say, okay, we'll sacrifice you. They really cannot sacrifice it.
How do you think the debt situation is going to play out? Who's gonna blink first on that?
Yeah, this is another one that's interesting. Kevin McCarthy in the past has always been an establishment Republican, the type that would essentially go along with big federal budgets. Part of the reason he's Speaker of the House, in the one hand, he made concessions to the Freedom Caucus, the conservative bloodline of the party, but also he has essentially, not even the Freedom Caucus voted against him, but some members of the party, he's tried to present themselves as their tribune, if you will. So now it is in his political benefit for him not to go with the Joe Biden administration and essentially extend the debt limit. And he also faces the possibility, and this is always a problem for him, that if he does go along with it, there'll be a primary challenger in Bakersfield, California, saying that Kevin McCarthy, he'll say is a Joe Biden Republican. He pretends he's a Republican, but he's really not. So it benefits him politically. Which side is going to blink first? I don't know. I do think for the Republican Party, they risked essentially the same scenario that happened to the Republican Party back in 1995 when there was a government shutdown, if you remember.
Right.
And the people that benefited was Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton came off and he would say, I'm here to protect the economy. I'm here to protect jobs. I'm here to protect Social Security. I'm here to protect Medicare. I'm here to protect the environment. So consequently, Bill Clinton lost 52 seats in the United States House of Representatives, 9 seats in the United States Senate, running in 1994. Some people said he was dead on arrival. After that government shutdown, Bill Clinton had the upper hand. Newt Gingrich was largely vilified. His job approval went down in the mid-20s, and he was seen as somebody who was kind of the stereotype of a Republican that does not care about social programs. So this could totally benefit Joe Biden in that respect. And here's what's fascinating. Donald Trump is talking about the debt limit. He actually acerbated that don't touch Social Security. This shows Donald Trump knows where his bread is buttered. When he ran for the nomination, him and Mike Huckabee were the only candidates who said we will not touch entitlements. Lots of Donald Trump supporters are not Ayn Rand devotees. They're not libertarians who just want the government essentially to be a limited purpose entity. They are people who essentially lots of them are Republicans because of social issues, because of abortion, sometimes because of gay marriage, because of quote unquote wokeism. But on economic issues, they're quite populist, and a lot of them actually need these programs. Donald Trump knows that. He does not want Kevin McCarthy to be pigeonholed the way Newt Gingrich was, as kind of a libertarian type Republican, the way he was in 1995, that just wants to innovate the size and scope of government. So this is something I think is going to benefit Joe Biden from a political standpoint.
So on an individual basis, McCarthy can benefit with his base back in Bakersfield by being very far right. But
absolutely.
in the bigger picture, the group that is seen to be responsible for a government shutdown gets hurt.
Yes, I think in terms of the Republican Party, in terms of how the Republican Party is viewed going into 2024, specifically with those kind of elusive swing voters, with those types of swing voters, I think that it's going to benefit. I think it's going to benefit Joe Biden. I think that back the last time it happened with the debt ceiling with Barack Obama, and then actually Moody's actually downgraded the credit rating of the United States. And talking about the political brinksmanship, if you will, that did not hurt. That did not help the Republican Party. There's kind of a disconnect here. There's the Republican Party, kind of in theory, the Republican Party, those that essentially got elected to limit the size of government. And then there are those who are Republicans who potentially maybe they were Democrats in the past who Donald Trump attracted based on social issues, but many of them are very dependent on many social programs. And then the other issue that's interesting, this is where the kind of political parties kind of transmogrify and switch. The Republican Party, some members of the Freedom Caucus, and this is where left meets right. I always say Ralph Nader's bicycle rams right into Pappy Cannon's Mercedes. Just like some folks on the left, like the Squad, Republicans, at least many of the Tea Party, former Tea Party folks, now the Freedom Caucus people, are consistent about truncating the size of government. They want to include the Pentagon in that. Some Republicans, it's always been for Republicans, they want to cut government, except when it comes to the Pentagon. When it comes to the Pentagon, they want to increase the size of it. Donald Trump the same way. Donald Trump increased the size of the Pentagon. But these Republicans, small government Republicans, are the ones who, I mean, some of these kind of rather Freedom Caucus members who are very populist say, yes, the Pentagon is not off the table. So now you have a scenario where some Democratic members are actually issuing press releases saying you cannot cut the Pentagon. So the Democrats, kind of the, I'm not talking about the left wing of the Democrat, I'm talking the center left Democrat of the Democratic Party, is now kind of present themselves as kind of any exponent of the military, as opposed to what had been their kind of view, which is essentially in a post-Cold War world, you have to kind of you have to transition from a military-based economy to a civilian-based economy.
So Fred McFadden, who I believe is out on the West Coast, says debt ceiling brinkmanship is disingenuous baloney. So I'm believing that means that everybody knows they're going to have to sign off on something, and it won't be that different. This is just fake posturing for their bases, and then they'll have to sign off at the last minute. Is that the case?
I think, yeah, I think there's a very legitimate argument in that. In Kevin McCarthy's case, he wants to show his conservative bona fides, and he has to show his base, both in Bakersfield and nationally. He has to show the conservatives who are lukewarm on him that he is not just another establishment Republican that will essentially agree with what will essentially make some sort of a deal with Joe Biden. I think Mitch McConnell is seen as an establishment Republican. He's somebody who's very much not trusted by the conservative intelligentsia, by the conservative base, if you will. But I think that Kevin McCarthy is probably positioning himself, but in the end of the day, from a political standpoint for his party, he probably does need to concede somewhat. But, in a concession, I think that it has to be a win-win politically for both Joe Biden and Kevin McCarthy. Joe Biden has to go back and he has to say, I'm the person, I'm the exponent, I'm the person who protected your programs. Kevin McCarthy has to be able to say, I'm the person who stood up to Joe Biden. So it's almost like you wonder if there's some sort of, a backroom deal where they're benefited both politically. I don't know.
As an aside, AOC, to me, in my naivete, seems like she's matured. Before she was, gung-ho, super lefty. But now she seems more of a statesperson and smarter and understanding that, how to keep power rather than try to get every niche thing in your basket and lose power. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, no, categorically. When she came to Congress, it was essentially an anomaly. She was elected and she was seen as very much a fringe candidate. But Joe Crowley, who was fourth in line in Democratic leadership, a potential Speaker of the House candidate when Nancy Pelosi retired, was spending all of his time in other congressional districts. And he did not pay attention to the proliferation of the progressive wing and the Hispanics in his congressional district and how much voting power they have. At one time, he literally sent an emissary, he sent an aide to debate because he was off somewhere else debating AOC. So AOC wins the primary. Nobody can believe it. And she comes in originally and she's part of the squad and she's seen as somebody who's almost kind of a standard bearer of the left wing of the Democratic Party, but not somebody who wanted to actually deal in the weeds and getting legislation passed. If you listen to her talking now, even when they talked about, for example, the speakership and would she support a moderate Republican as a speaker, as an alternative to Kevin McCarthy, she comes off very much of a moderate now in that respect. I'm not saying she's a moderate ideologically because she's one of the most liberal members of her party. But when she talks about that, she knows essentially that you cannot always take the far left line from a political standpoint and try to actually accomplish something. There are two types of people in Congress. There are workhorses and show horses. A workhorse is usually the people you don't hear that much about. They're on the Appropriations Committee, for example. Someone like Richard Shelby from Alabama was on there, Patty Murray from Washington. They bring a lot of resources, a lot of largesse, so dare we say they used to be earmarks, to their states. But they're on a committee that gets very little attention, and they're more spoils people, whether they're Democrats or they're Republicans, whether they consider themselves conservatives or liberals. Before all of that, they are people who want to actually make deals, and they want to be able to go to their constituents and say, look at this dam I brought you, look at this money I brought you for community college. Then there are those who are essentially ideologues. You could say that they're show horses. They're the ones that are on television all the time, especially espousing ideological agendas. But in terms of what they can actually bring to their district, what legislation they can actually get passed, I'm not talking about legislation they propose that never goes anywhere. They're usually the show horses that you see most of the time on television. I think AOC is trying to become somewhat of a workhorse. Now, alternatively, and here's an interesting comparison, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was elected to the United States Congress, and when she was elected in part because what she had talked about the possibility that 9/11 was an inside job, she talked about how the Clintons potentially had JFK Jr. killed in New York so that Hillary Clinton could run for that United States Senate seat. She talked about a coterie of Jews with space lasers starting wildfires. Now she, just like AOC, she has kind of mainstreamed herself to the point that while folks like Lori Bobart and kind of her cohorts were opposed to Kevin McCarthy, she was saying Kevin McCarthy is the best possible speaker we can have. So she almost became somewhat of a voice of reason in that respect. And now I think that the fact that she's actually on a committee, and a very important committee in the Homeland Security Committee, shows that she's kind of understands that the role of a legislature is not just to kind of go in there, be a bomb thrower. It can be that if you're only playing to your base, but if you actually want, in her case, if you actually want to shepherd a conservative agenda through the United States Congress, sometimes you have to actually work with the establishment.
Right. So in case of both Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC, they must be more confident that they will maintain the votes of their district, even though they may go more moderately than they would have in the past. It seems like in the beginning they're scared to alienate their extreme base. As time goes on, they get a little more confident that they've checked in incrementally with how the people feel about different things, and they learn, I can be a little more moderate, and they're not going to dump me.
Okay, no, categorically. In the case of AOC, the person she succeeded was actually somewhat of a center-left, somewhat of a moderate establishment-type Democrat. So it's not like she comes from it's not like she represents Berkeley, California. She represents a Democratic district, but it's not demonstrably liberal. In the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, Sam Graves, the person that she succeeded in the United States Congress, was basically a conservative Republican, but he was not necessarily one of the most ideological members of Congress. And I mean, her district is not necessarily conducive to the most conservative members of the United States Congress necessarily. A lot of furniture is produced in her district. For example, in Fulton, Georgia, is known as the furniture capital of the world. They want an advocate in Congress. They don't necessarily only want somebody who's going to kind of stand up and, somebody who's going to send a message, if you will. They actually want somebody who's going to be effective. Her predecessor was somewhat effective for the district. It's interesting in Marjorie Taylor Greene's case. In her debate, she had one debate with her Democratic opponent last time around. And one of the questions was, what have you essentially done for the district? And her answer was, well, we brought a lot of grant money in. That's essentially all she was saying, which is something that any sort of a congressman can essentially say to their constituents. The next time she runs, and it's a demonstrably Democratic district, Republican district rather, I think she wants to actually say some sort of piece of legislation she worked to get passed, some funding she brought for the community college, kind of the traditional legislating that's not necessarily ideologically focused.
Right. Let's go back to the topic, original topic, Mavericks. Can you tell us more about some famous Mavericks?
Yes, absolutely. I think that if you go back, for example, I think Jeanette Rankin is certainly one. She was a congresswoman elected in Montana. She was a freshman congresswoman, and she voted against going into World War I. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, this was the last time they actually had a congressional declaration of war. I'm not saying just authorizing military force. Actually, under the Constitution, it says Congress shall declare war, and they actually had a declaration. And she served one term. She came back later in life, served another term. She was the only member of the United States Congress to vote against that resolution, to vote against the Congressional Declaration of War. In part, she suggested that the Roosevelt administration, her own party, had known, she thinks they may have known that Pearl Harbor was coming, and she was very anti-war. Now, fast forward to 2001, after the 9/11 hijackings, when America, everywhere from Dennis Kucinich and Bernie Sanders on the left, even Ron Paul voted for it, who was one of the most non-interventionist congressmen probably in American history, the resolution essentially authorizing President George W. Bush to use force to go into Afghanistan to try to enfeeble Al Qaeda and the Taliban. There was one member, Barbara Lee, who voted against that resolution. Basically, she said this was not the time. She said that there was too much haste and suggested that it probably would not be the best possible scenario to put a predominantly Christian army invading a Muslim country. She came from one of the most congressional liberal districts in the country in Berkeley, California, and many people in her district liked it. She continues to get reelected. She's probably running for Senate in California if Dianne Feinstein retires this time around. She's still in Congress, but at the time there were so many threats against her that she actually had to have Capitol Police protecting her, because essentially it was the idea you run American. And if you fast forward later on in 2020, Bernie Sanders and some other Democrats said that essentially they agree now with Barbara Lee that we should not that it was too much haste, and it's now become more and more mainstream to the point that even Donald Trump has suggested that going into Afghanistan was a mistake. And United States Congress, on both the right and the left, there was very little appetite for continuing the presence in Afghanistan. When Donald Trump made that respective deadline that in May that the all United States troops would be out, there was bipartisan support for that at the time. And I'll say one other example was 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Lyndon Johnson wanted carte blanche, or a blank check, if you will, to go into Vietnam. The House of Representatives, 416-0, it passed. At the time, not every member was there. In the Senate, you had two members, Ernest Gruning from Alaska and Wayne Morse from Oregon, who voted against that resolution. A couple years later, 1968, when 1968, it became fashionable to be against the Vietnam War, and they became kind of heroes, if you will, to the point that even George McGovern, who ran in 1972, Eugene McCarthy, the anti-Vietnam War candidate in 1968, they voted for that resolution. These are the only two members who did not. So those are some, I think, examples.
What are a couple of key issues, or let's say, in your opinion, the key issue in this upcoming cycle, and who will likely play the maverick roles in regarding this thing that you choose to be the key issue?
Yeah, there are three Democrats running for re-election this time around who come from states where Joe Biden lost in 2020. You have Sherrod Brown, who is a maverick in this sense. He's a populist. He comes from Ohio. Ohio is a center-right state. It's a state that's becoming more and more conservative. J.D. Vance just defeated Tim Ryan, a very redoubtable candidate in the last time around, the Republican candidate. The Democrat, Sherrod Brown, he's a maverick in that he is not a centrist. I don't think he would present himself as a centrist. He's very much populist. He's written books against NAFTA, for example. He has a very liberal voting record. The question is, will he somehow be able to go to the center? The other examples of Republicans, of Democrats in conservative states, John Tester of Montana. Montana went 20 points for Donald Trump last time around. It went for Bill Clinton in 1992. Since then, it really hasn't gone for a Democrat since LBJ's enormous landslide back in 1964. He presents himself essentially as a rural Democrat, which is rare because that's where the Democrats are the weakest, in rural parts of the country. But he spends a lot of time. He's personally a rancher. He spends a lot of time focusing on ranching issues, kind of the non-sexy issues that garner very little attention. He's also a former chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, so he can focus on constituent service. And as some folks have called him, as some Democrats have called him, he said essentially he's Mr. Montana because he actually focuses on those issues. So he has a chance at re-election to that respect if he were to run. Now, he may not run because he's got 9 hours to go from Montana to Washington State, and he's 66 years old. Washington, D.C., 66 years old. It's a horrible commute, and he might decide, why go through this whole thing. And the other is Joe Manchin. And Joe Manchin is somebody that should not be there, essentially. There are no other Democrats in statewide office. Joe Manchin is the last vestige of a state that used to be very Democrat. Bill Clinton won it by 18 points running for re-election in 1996, only making one appearance there. It's become more and more Republican, in part because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump presenting himself as an exponent, as a tribune, if you will, of the coal industry. He really kind of tailor-made for West Virginia. So what is Joe Manchin doing? Well, Joe Manchin was an original opponent of the Build Back Better. He's someone who negotiated the Inflation Reduction Act with Chuck Schumer to kind of enervate or weaken it a little bit. So he's somebody who is presenting, and he's somebody who was supportive of the filibuster. So he's presenting himself as somebody who can kind of work both sides. Many Republican business people, benefactors, only give to one or two Democrats, and it's usually Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Every time he's in the national news for going against his party, he's benefiting himself politically in West Virginia. But he was a maverick, I guess you can say, in the sense that he finally signed off on the Inflation Reduction Act. And that gave issues for Republicans to say he's just another Chuck Schumer Democrat. Alex Maloney, running for Congress, running for Senate, one of their potential Republican candidates, he's basically said the same thing, that Joe Manchin has caved in that respect. So it's very interesting, but those are certainly some examples. And I'll say one more would be Jared Golden in Maine, a Trump district, one of those very rare congressional Trump districts that went for Donald Trump, also went for Jared Golden. He's often the only Democrat, for example, the only Democrat, or one of two with Kurt Schrader of Oregon, to vote against background checks, for example, on firearms. So he's somebody who I think is able to kind of, and the COVID relief as well, he's able to come back to his constituent and say, look, I'm a maverick. I take on my own party.
So Sarah Palin said she was a maverick. That was her. She coined that phrase for herself. She used that phrase for herself.
Oh, yes.
What was she? Was she, though?
Yes, she actually was. And that's part of the reason John McCain picked her. When she was governor of Alaska, she took on her own party in the legislature. She won, actually. She defeated Frank Murkowski, the father of Lisa Murkowski, the United States senator who succeeded him. She defeated an incumbent establishment Republican, got to the governorship, and then when she got there, she worked on ethics reform. She sometimes worked with Democrats, actually sometimes in the case raising taxes. She had a 91% job approval rating the day John McCain picked her. That was the message John McCain wanted. He could have picked Mitt Romney. He could have picked Tom Ridge. He could have picked Tim Valente, more establishment candidates who maybe would benefit you 1 or 2 points or disbenefit you 1 or 2 points. He knew that George W. Bush had a job approval rating under 35%, and no president with a job approval of 35% or lower has their party maintain the White House. He had to do something completely dramatic. This lady who had been mayor of a city of Wasilla, Alaska, of about 11,000 people, just a few years earlier, won an Alaska race. Won the Alaska race, is seen as somebody who took on her own party. He says, we have to choose this person as our running mate. I understand completely why he did it. And she had been a maverick because she had taken on her own party. And she was somebody who actually had bipartisan support as governor. But then after John McCain chose her, she kind of moved to the far right, and she became really an advocate of conservatism, to the point that a lot of the folks who had liked her in the past, even in Alaska, really became off-putting toward her. And she just ran for Congress last time around, and she did not win, even though she had a 91% job approval at one point. I think that Mary Peralta, part of the reason that she beat her is that people now in Alaska do not view her as kind of a maverick. They view a maverick in terms of somebody who takes on her own party. They now view her as simply kind of an ideologue of the conservative gospel.
So why did she move to the right after getting chosen?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. I think that in part, I think that she gave one speech at the Republican National Convention where she talked about being a hockey mom. She talked about being mayor of a small city, being better than a community organizer, which is what Barack Obama had done at one point. And I think that all of a sudden, many Republicans who were lukewarm on John McCain came to her and said, yes, we're going to support John McCain because we really like Sarah Palin. And all of a sudden she becomes a champion, if you will, of the right wing of the Republican Party. And she just kind of kept going. For a while, I also think she was thinking about potentially running for president in 2012. If you remember, her and John McCain lost, she resigned the governorship midterm. People were saying, why is she resigning the governorship midterm? And partly she was looking at a potential, and then for whatever reason, she decided not to do it. But she really became kind of an advocate of conservatism. But that wasn't necessarily her MO when she was governor for at least that 1.5 years before John McCain picked her from political obscurity outside of Alaska.
All right. So if Maverick Palin suffered for going too far to the right, will the Freedom Caucus people currently stirring things up in the House also suffer a similar fate?
I think public relations wise, yes, because now people look at the Freedom Caucus, and the first thing a lot of at least people who are not conservative, who are moderate, who are center right, who are even center left now, look at them and they say, oh, those are the people that obstructed. Those are the people that put out this whole process about Kevin McCarthy, that made him concede. But politically, a lot of these members come from very conservative congressional districts. Oklahoma, one represents a district that went 52 points for Trump last time. So they're going to go back to home. They're going to be able to say, we took on the Democrats and we took on the Republican Party. That's going to benefit them. There will not be a primary challenge. And in the general election, it's going to essentially be pro forma. Just like with Marjorie Taylor Greene last time around and Matt Gaetz, they run in the general election. The Democrats put up some sacrificial lamb. That sacrificial lamb goes nowhere. The Republican doesn't even have to, does not even essentially have to campaign. So in that respect, it benefits them. The only one I think it potentially could hurt would be Scott Perry. Scott Perry from Pennsylvania comes from actually what's becoming more and more of a swing district right around Harrisburg. Pennsylvania is a weird state, like James Carville said. It's like you have Pittsburgh on one side, Philadelphia on the other, and Alabama in between. And you have this kind of disconnect between East Pennsylvania and West Pennsylvania. So it's an interesting state. He represents kind of somewhat of a moderate district, kind of in the center there, but he's somebody that represents a district where I think a Democrat, if they put up a formidable challenger, could essentially say that Scott Perry is too far right for this district. But other than him, it's really one other would be Lori Boebert, who, despite the fact that Donald Trump won a resounding victory in her congressional district in 2022, she won by less than a half a percentage point last time around. So she's one that potentially could actually be hurt by this.
All right. Back to Alaska. So Alaska must not be as far right as one might expect if Sarah Palin's going to the right hurt her in the long run. You'd think that would be really right-wing out there because they're all self-sufficient. Well, you picture them all self-sufficient on your own out there hunting and fishing and all, but not as right-wing as you might expect if her going right hurt her like that in the long run.
Yeah, and that's a different wing of the Republican Party. And by the way, it's interesting, Sarah Palin often presents herself as having been governor of the largest state in the country, which is technically true, but you don't take into account the population, that it's so small that it literally has one congressional district that's that large. But if you include, I guess all the non-humans, and if you include the land, yeah, it's the biggest state in the country. It's Alaska. So Alaska has not gone, at least for a Democrat for president, since LBJ's landslide in 1964, and that's really the only time it's voted for a Democrat. But it has had Democratic United States senators. It's had Democratic governors. The person she beat, who was trying to run for an unconsecutive third term, was Tony Knowles, who was a relatively popular Democratic governor. So there's a redoubtable Democratic Party in the state of Alaska. And a lot of first of all, right around Anchorage, for example, there are many union members. In Juneau, many state government employees. But then as you go, obviously, to the outer fringes of the state of Alaska, and you get some very self-sufficient, kind of libertarian type Republicans, if you will. But they're not Republicans that, for example, are focused on abortion rights or gay marriage. They're usually focused on many respects. You're right. They're very much self-sufficient, and some of them just kind of want the government to leave them alone. They're folks that Mary Peralta, the woman who just won that seat, this at-large seat, Dawn Young, who was the senior member, the dean of the House of Representatives, died in the middle of his term, and she won the seat. She's a Democrat. And then she won again in the second election against Sarah Palin. She's somebody who presents herself as a pro-choice, pro-gun, pro-fish Democrat, meaning essentially when it comes to gun control, she's very much against gun control. Abortion rights, she's very much a supporter of abortion rights. And on fishing, she wants as few restrictions on commercial fishing in Alaska as essentially one can possibly have. So that's kind of a libertarian type of a Democrat, and those are the Democrats that can get elected in the state of Alaska. But in terms of somebody who's simply an ideologue and who's simply an exponent of conservatism, I really can't think of anybody in Alaska who's really kind of been elected on that platform, although Don Sullivan, one of the United States senators from Alaska, is relatively conservative. By the way, Lisa Murkowski is very much of a moderate Republican, but she gets elected in the state of Alaska, and they have a very interesting jungle primary type system. Essentially, everybody runs together, but they also have instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting. So essentially, which means that a voter goes to the polls, there are 7 candidates, all different parties. So if you go and you vote for candidate 1 and then you say, this is my first choice, I really like candidate 1, but I don't think he's going to win, so I'm going to vote for candidate 2, and so I'm going to get candidate 2 as my second choice. The first candidate doesn't get 15% of the vote. Your vote goes to that second choice. It'd be like in 2000, if voters came and wanted to vote for Ralph Nader, they could vote for Ralph Nader as their first choice. Nader doesn't win the 15%, then they could vote for Al Gore. So they have a kind of an interesting system. Maine has it as well.
Let's do one final question. Comes back from Fred on the West Coast. How do parties recruit sacrificial lamb candidates?
Usually because nobody else will do it. That is a great question. And often that's because nobody else will run, and you get a lot of publicity. I always say that if I ever start a law firm or start some sort of a business, the best thing you need to do is run for United States Congress. Think about how much media attention you get, that free attention, and they say, this person, he or she, is also a business owner in the district. I mean, you can't. If you spend $7,000 to get a newspaper ad, this is basically commensurate to that, if you will. So I think a lot of people potentially, maybe they want to run again at some point. Susan Collins, the first time she ran for Senate, for example, was probably a sacrificial lamb, garnered a little bit of media attention. Sometimes it'll be the same candidate that will run 3 or 4 times and will continue to run for re-election. Sometimes it's because they want to weaken the candidate. For example, in 1998. George W. Bush had a 76% job approval rating in the state of Texas. So the Democrats, whoever they put up, was going to lose. So Gary Morrow, the land commissioner, decided that he was going to run. And the Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, knew that George W. Bush was probably going to be the Republican nominee in 2000. So what did they do? They spent an inordinate amount of time in Texas campaigning for Gary Morrow, trying to see what type of message would enervate or weaken George W. Bush. So he was a sacrificial lamb. No one thought he was actually going to win. He wins 31% of the vote in that race. But that would be, I think, so sometimes that's one reason. That's one reason that somebody might actually do that. Somebody might actually be a sacrificial lamb. They have kind of a long-term agenda, if you will. But normally those sacrificial lambs, sometimes they'll get one debate out of the candidate. Sometimes they won't get any debate out of the candidate. Strom Thurmond, for example, would never debate his opponents. Even when they would ask him, he would not debate because he knew that he could not benefit under any circumstance. And the last time around, some Democrats got away with not debating their opponents by saying that they were election deniers and will not justify debating an election denier when those candidates were really kind of just sacrificial lambs. But if you want to garner a lot of media attention and you want to get either your name brand out there or your company name out there, I would suggest running for United States Congress.
Which brings me to President Trump. Didn't he really perceive himself as a sacrificial lamb? Didn't he really run just to get attention and generate cash and help his businesses out? He didn't really expect to win. Wasn't that what he was doing? And he won accidentally.
That's one of the theories. Remember, he talked about running in the past.
Yeah, for the same reason, to enhance his brand.
But every time that he's done it before, in 2000, the Reform Party, he was thinking about running as a Reform Party nominee. Eventually, he leaves, says the party's too extreme, too anti-immigrant. Pat Buchanan's a Hitler lover who garners the nomination. He puts himself out, so he gets in there. He pretends then 2012, the same thing. He was thinking about running. He's saying, you know what, I just might do it. Then at the end, he pulled himself out. 2016, he actually went through with it. But the one thing, and potentially, obviously, when he does it, it helps out his brand. The fact that he actually went through with it, though, this is what's interesting. The one thing Donald Trump cannot stand in life is being a loser.
Right.
He hates losers. Mm. So what would have happened had Donald Trump actually lost the Republican nomination? Could he? Now, potentially, my guess is he would have maybe said it was purloined from me, it was stolen from me by the establishment, and then he could have run as an independent. But then eventually he could have said, well, then you run as an independent and the Electoral College is racked against me, something like that. But I've always been interested if he did lose and he lost badly in the primaries, how he would justify his loss, because he does not want to lose anything.
Right. So the obvious answer to that is desire for attention is stronger than his fear of losing.
That's a possibility. He certainly is somebody who will do anything in order to garner attention on himself, even if it's itself or its brands or anything else. But it's interesting. He got into this race, and it was a divergent message to stuff he's always had. He was never somebody who was necessarily a conservative. He was someone who would give money to Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, sometimes give Republicans too, because he was transactional. It wasn't he was an ideologue. It was essentially,
right.
And he's not the only one to do this. You give money to everybody that's running against each other, and then they all kind of owe you in some respects. So he's not somebody who was seen as an ideologue, but he's someone who said Hillary Clinton was a great senator. Bill Clinton should never have been impeached in 1998. So he was never really necessarily a conservative. I think Roger Stone, Steve Bannon presented himself in this image, this caricature of a populist conservative, not a traditional conservative in terms of Eisenhower or Nixon or Ford or Reagan or Bush or George W. Bush. He would be a social conservative and essentially a fiscal populist, and somebody who would run in the Pat Buchanan mold, as I always say, of saying that we need to essentially restrict trade, we need to restrict immigration, we need to restrict not only illegal immigration, but we need to retrench legal immigration as well. And he was someone who says, just get out of all these wars. We need to have a non-interventionist foreign policy. And as a result, he essentially becomes the candidate of the blue-collar Republican, not the traditional kind of libertarian-type Republican. And now that's the establishment view of the conservative Republican Party.
Rich Rubino, great job. I'm not a political expert in any way, but each time I speak with you, I get a little bit less dumb. Maybe not exactly smarter, but less dumb. So thank you very much. Hold up your book. I love this book.
Yes.
This is Rich Rubino's
There's
one of his books. This is the big heavy book. You might want to get started on your Christmas shopping. There are a couple books there. The trivia one is
The
great.
Great American Political Trivia Challenge. Political trivia on steroids. Yes.
Give me a question.
It's essentially the Bible of today.
Can you give wow? Can you give me a trivia question, please? I know I'm not going to get it, and when I don't know, I'm just going to say I don't know. But give me the question.
Okay. Let me think of one that would be really interesting.
I don't mind being wrong because I always learn from it. So go ahead.
Okay. Here's one that I think you might find interesting, and I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but which candidate first elected to the United States Congress did it in part by the person he was running against? He paid somebody with the same name to get their name on the ballot. So then people would go to the polls and they would see two people with the same name, and as a result, they split that person's vote, and this other candidate wins.
That's a good one. I do not know.
Okay, John F. Kennedy. And this is Joe Kennedy's strategy. This is what he did. The guy named Joe Russo, a city councilor, there was a janitor in the district. So at the very last minute, they went to this guy and said, "Can we put your name on the ballot?" He said, "Okay." So they went off, got the signatures. Then people go to the polls. Joe Russo. I'm going to vote for Joe Russo. Other people's going to say, "Well, there's Joe Russo." And this landed up benefiting John F. Kennedy in his first congressional race back in 1946. And also, John F. Kennedy was the one who made up the term the missile gap when he ran for re-election in 1958. And he basically propagated this kind of mendacious view that the Russians had more missiles than the United States.
Right.
But this was not true. He did the same when he ran against Richard Nixon in 1960. And Robert McNamara, when they were talking about the military budget, brought up the fact that the Russians actually do not have more missiles than the United States. And John Kennedy said, "Oh, well, I might have been just one of those misguided patriotic Americans who essentially believed that and kind of winked, if you will." But the damage was done, and that was one of and here's one other thing about John F. Kennedy. There was another guy named John F. Kennedy, a stockroom supervisor, who ran for treasurer of Massachusetts when Kennedy was in the United States Senate. One contribution, $300 from his mother. No political experience, no real campaigning. Put his name on the ballot. People went to the polls, and they thought it was the same John Kennedy, so that person ended up becoming treasurer of Massachusetts.
Jeez. See, there's two of thousands in that book. And you had another book there. What was that other one you held up? Or was that two copies of the same one?
American Politics on the Rocks. This is essentially unusual presidential facts, feisty first ladies, family feuds, debate debacles, the debate debacles, humiliating bloopers, inflammatory insults, and I love the blooper part. I love the bloopers. It reminds me of Michelle Bachmann, for example. She went to when she announced her presidential candidacy. She went to Waterloo, Iowa, which is where she was born. She said, "I'm so glad to be here in my hometown," which is also the birthplace of that great actor, John Wayne. But John Wayne never lived in Waterloo, Iowa. But you know who did?
John Wilkes Booth.
John
Wayne Gacy.
John Wayne, yes, absolutely. So he,
Oh, you know, you're out there. You have to think on your feet. You say stuff. Although that was probably planned and not very well. Wow.
She also went to Concord, New Hampshire, and said she's very glad to be here. I know this is where your ancestors, the ancestors were involved with the shot heard around the world, which of course was Concord, Massachusetts, not Concord, New Hampshire. And interestingly enough, John Wilkes Booth, there was one point where Abraham Lincoln's son actually fell down on a train track, and the person that picked him up,
he caught him.
Wasn't John Wilkes Booth, but John Wilkes Booth's brother. Yes.
Edwin.
Yes.
Okay. Guess I'm not as dumb as I thought.
No,
I better quit while I'm ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, Rich Rubino. If you ever want to put, a blurb, so you can say, Rubino is a fabulous guest, Bradley J. You have my endorsement.
Yes, I will absolutely. I will do that categorically.
Okay. Thank you. I hope we can do this again next week.
I would love to, and I look forward to it.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
3, 2.